Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 129th deck and it's titled the Aris Tour Niko's version. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us over on Discord by one of our patrons, Calvin, and he suggested that we play Niko Aris. So Niko Aris is X white blue blue for a 3 loyalty legendary planeswalker Niko. When Niko Aris enters the battlefield, create X shard tokens. Then we can +1 Niko and up to 1 target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. Whenever that creature deals damage this turn, return it to its owner's hand. -1, Niko Aris deals 2 damage to target tapped creature for each card you've drawn this turn. And -1, create a shard token. Now, I didn't read the reminder text on shards, but it is worth noting that they are able to pay 2, sacrifice it, scry 1, draw a card, but more importantly, they're actually enchantments. And that's going to become incredibly relevant when we start talking about some themes of this deck, and of course, our commander. So this week, we're doing things a little bit differently than you might expect with some of our themes, because our commander is going to be Amareth the Lustrous. So Amareth the Lustrous is 3 green, white, blue for a 6/6 legendary creature dragon. It's got flying, and whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it shares a card type with that permanent, you may reveal that card and put it into your hand. It is very important that Amareth says whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control. Because what that means for us is that we can cast Niko, and then when they make all those shard tokens, every single one of those is going to trigger Amareth. And we get to look at the top card of our library for every single one. And if we're lucky enough that the top couple of cards are enchantments, we get to just reveal them and put them into our hand. So Amareth is a huge draw engine and a big card draw engine, in the sense that even though we're not technically drawing cards, we're at least putting them into our hand. And that's going to be something that is very relevant when we're making a ton of shard tokens. So obviously, with that in mind, you can probably guess our first theme of the week, because it is going to be enchantments. And we are specifically focusing on enchantments that care about constellation. So let's read an example, such as Eidolon of Blossoms, which is 2 green green for a 2/2 enchantment creature spirit, constellation. Whenever Eidolon of Blossoms or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So because we are focusing in on creatures with constellation, which is when an enchantment enters the battlefield, not when we cast an enchantment, if we make 5 shards with Niko when we cast them, then we're able to draw 5 cards right away with Eidolon of Blossoms. And of course we have other constellation cards in here as well, but that is going to be our primary focus, making sure that at any point when we get Niko, we can really benefit from their ability to make a ton of shards, so that way we can just kind of flood the board with enchantments and then get a ton of value from it. And that does, though, lead us into our second theme for this deck, which is going to be specifically having creatures that are also making other creatures. So we have Archon of Sun's Grace, which is 2 white white for a creature Archon, flying lifelink, Pegasus, creatures you control have lifelink, and, once again, Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token with flying. Now, most of the creatures in our deck are going to be enchantments. We did focus pretty hard on having enchantment creatures because that allows us to double up on the effect from Amareth. When an enchantment enters, we could get an enchantment creature, or when a creature enters, we could get an enchantment creature. That also means that if an enchantment creature enters, we could get both an enchantment or a creature. But unfortunately, that does mean that a lot of our board is weak to enchantment-based removal, so we wanted to make sure that we have other things in the deck that make non-enchantment creatures as well, such as the Archon of Sun's Grace. So being able to make a ton of 2/2 white Pegasus creature tokens that also have flying and also have lifelink can really start to turn the tide in our favor, because there's a good chance that our opponents will want to be attacking us with all of the value that we're going to be accruing. Enchantress can kind of get out of hand very quickly, so we need to make sure we have creatures to defend ourselves. And then, finally, our last theme for the deck, ramp. Of course, we have a ton of cards in our deck that are very, very expensive. But the big one here is Amareth being 6 mana and Niko being X and 3, meaning we need a ton of mana to be able to get to the point where we can cast Niko and get a reasonable amount of shards. And to do that, I wanted to focus in on specifically Enchantment ramp, because that's going to work more with what we're doing with the deck and trigger some of our constellation while ramping us at the same time. Plus, then we get access to some amazing 1-mana ramp spells, which is not something that most decks have access to. So a good example of that is Wild Growth for 1 green mana for an enchantment aura, enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional green. Not a lot of our deck is going to care too much about having green versus blue or white, but being able to make just any additional mana is incredibly important. And if we're lucky enough, we can put Wild Growth on a land that produces white or blue, so we're able to kind of color fix at the same time. Again, it might not be perfect. Of course, just producing 1 color in our 3-color deck is not where we want to be, but we do also have a ton of other enchantment auras that produce other colors of lands as well. So those are our themes for this week. And of course, the next thing we got to do is talk about some of our key cards. These are the cards that, even if they may not necessarily be win conditions, which, spoiler alert, some of them are, they're also going to be producing enough value for us to kind of slowly take over the game. So the first card is one that I have personally taken as a bit of a pet card recently, and I would like to argue that if you're not playing this in your deck, you probably should be, and that is Starlight Spectacular, which is surprisingly only 52 cents for an absolutely game-ending card, because Starlight Spectacular is 2 white for an enchantment with Parade. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose creatures you control 1 at a time until each creature you control has been chosen. Each of those creatures gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature chosen before it. Now, that is a lot of words, but essentially, if we have 5 creatures on the board, we go through and we choose each of them when we move to combat. The first one gets +0/+0 because we didn't choose any creatures before it. The next one gets +1/+1, then +2, then +3, and finally +4. Meaning that even if we started with 5 1/1s, we now have a 1/1, a 2/2, a 3/3, a 4/4, and a 5/5. That really starts to tip the balance in our favor, because you have to remember we're making a ton of little token creatures with all of our constellation cards. So being able to flood the board with tokens and then give them a super anthem is going to be incredibly relevant and honestly pretty game ending, especially with some of the other cards in our deck that may be able to make things unblockable or give them trample. Starlight Spectacular, I really can't hype it up enough. Every single time I've been able to play this card, it puts in a ton of work. So you should be playing it more, in my own personal opinion. I've gotten to the point where I've put it in most of the decks that I run that have white. So I'm not going to ramble anymore about that one. I just think it's great. Anyway, we'll move on to our second key card. And this one, it's going to be a little bit tough to read. I apologize. Is Invasion of Theros. I know you may have to turn your head a little bit, but it is a battle. It's a siege. So when it comes in, you choose a player to defend it. And then when it's defeated, we transform it. And it comes in with 4 counters on it. But also importantly, when it enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for an aura, god, or demigod card, reveal it, put it into our hand, then shuffle. We don't have a ton of auras, gods, and demigods, but we do have enough to make this relevant. But really what this is in here for is the backside, because the backside of Invasion of Theros turns into Ephara Ever Sheltering. And Ephara Ever Sheltering is a 4/4 legendary enchantment creature god, so she enters as an enchantment and as a creature, which is great for what we want to do. And Ephara Ever Sheltering has lifelink and indestructible as long as you control at least 3 other enchantments. We most likely will. And whenever another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So not only is this a card draw engine, but she's also an unstoppable beater because she's going to be a 4/4 with lifelink and indestructible. And again, she won't always be an indestructible lifelinker, but there's a good chance that she will be most of the time because that's just how our deck functions. And even if we're using her as a blocker, she's an indestructible blocker that gains us life. So really, what more could we ask for when we're just sitting here drawing cards with her ability? So with all of that, let's move on to our next and final key card, and this one is Brilliant Restoration. At some point over the course of the game, there's a good chance someone will destroy all of our enchantments. That's just kind of what happens. We should kind of be prepared for that. And so the best way we can be prepared for that is with Brilliant Restoration, which is 3 and a massive white, so a big mana cost for a sorcery that just simply says return all artifact and enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. By being able to just reanimate all of our enchantments, there's a good chance that we are able to just draw most of our deck, maybe make a bunch of stuff unblockable, make a ton of tokens, and then all of a sudden have something like Starlight Spectacular or Afara to really just kind of close out the game. Or I guess we technically couldn't get Afara because she is a battle on the front side, so that is worth noting. But my point still stands that we can really run away with the game with Brilliant Restoration, and more than anything, we can use this almost as a finisher to just kind of come in and get us whatever we need in the last possible moments when most of our board has been blown up throughout the course of the game. But those are our 3 key cards for this week, and the next thing I would like to do is take a look at some cool interactions we have in the deck. These are cards that synergize very well together and just kind of, again, like with our key cards, push us toward a victory if they don't outright win the game. So our first cool interaction is going to be between Catilda Dawnheart Martyr and Hallowed Haunting. And I know, surprise, surprise, there's 2 cards that work well that were printed in the same set. It's almost like there's synergies. Who would have guessed? But Catilda Dawnheart Martyr is 1 white for a star legendary creature spirit warlock. She has flying, lifelink, and protection from vampires. And Catilda Dawnheart Martyr's power and toughness are each equal to the number of permanents you control that are spirits and or enchantments. So there's a good chance that she could be a very large creature considering she counts how many enchantments we have. She does also have Disturb for 3 white, which means that if she dies, we can cast the backside of Catilda's Rising Dawn, which is a legendary enchantment aura that essentially just gives whoever we enchant the same abilities that Catilda had, so getting +X, where X is the number of spirits and or enchantments we control, plus the flying lifelink and protection from vampires. Maybe that'll come in handy, who knows? But the reason that this is going to be so good in our deck is when we combine it with Hallowed Haunting. And I know this is the second week in a row we've talked about Hallowed Haunting. Turns out the card is very good. Hallowed Haunting is 2 white for an enchantment. As long as you control 7 or more enchantments, creatures you control have flying and vigilance. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, create a white spirit cleric creature token with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of spirits you control. This one in particular doesn't really boost itself based on enchantments, but when we cast 1 enchantment, we get a spirit, then we have an enchantment and a spirit, and Catilda is going to see both and get +2/+2. That's going to be something that really closes out the game very quickly, and even if it doesn't necessarily start knocking people out of the game, even though Catilda probably also has vigilance thanks to Hallowed Haunting, she's an amazing blocker because of the lifelink and flying. Plus, again, the protection from vampires. Maybe you're playing a vampire deck and it just happens to work out. But being able to drop a bunch of enchantments and then also get a bunch of creatures to go along with it is incredibly important. And having those creatures boost up Catilda and possibly whatever enchanted creature we put Catilda's Rising Dawn onto means that we can go wide and also go tall at the same time and just kind of start taking people out of the game. So I don't anticipate this to be a game ender all the time, but it's at least enough to keep you in the game. If people don't have flying blockers, then it also becomes a game ender. But that's enough about the first cool interaction. Let's take a look at our second one, and this one is going to be between Weaver of Harmony and Whitewater Naiads. So in all honesty, I could probably put any enchantment creature in Whitewater Naiad's spot because of the fact that Weaver of Harmony gives other enchantment creatures you control +1/+1 for only 1 and a green. So that is very good on its own. Plus, it's an enchantment creature as well, so it's going to trigger all of our enchantment effects. But the real reason I wanted to talk about Whitewater Naiads is because of Weaver of Harmony's second ability, For a green and tap, you can copy target activated or triggered ability you control from an enchantment source. You may choose new targets for the copy. And that's relevant because Whitewater Naiads is 3 blue for a 4/4 enchantment creature nymph with constellation. Whenever Whitewater Naiads or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, target creature can't be blocked this turn. With the Weaver of Harmony, we can actually double that ability, making 2 creatures unblockable when we cast a single enchantment. And that doesn't sound that impressive, but you've got to keep in mind that a lot of our creatures are going to be very, very big. So if we can turn something like Catilda, who could be as big as like a 10/10 or a 15/15, into an unblockable creature, there's not much our opponents are going to be able to do to stop it, other than removing Catilda when we go to attack or removing something else, whatever our attacking creature is. And at that point, they're spending a removal spell. We've still got Whitewater Naiads because it's tough to say that you want to remove the thing making stuff unblockable when there's a giant creature threatening to attack you. So it really plays into it very nicely, and of course, Whitewater Naiads being an enchantment creature means that it gets the +1/+1 from Weaver of Harmony, so if you do want to make the Naiads themselves unblockable, it is just a 5/5 with this ability on the stack, and being able to just kind of get in there whenever you need to is very important in a game of Commander. So that brings us to the end of our cool interactions. And of course, the last thing we got to do in this deck tech is talk a little bit about the price of the deck. And this week, our price came in at $94.08. And so not super far off of our budget. We're about $6 below where we want to be, but still pretty impressive, especially when you consider that a lot of our budget actually came from a single card this week, and that is Nylea's Colossus at a massive $11.07. So if you were looking to trim the price of the deck down, you could get it to about $83, but just by cutting this one card. And the reason it's in here, though, and one of the reasons I would recommend you not cut it, even though it may be tempting for budget purposes, is because Nylea's Colossus is a 6-green, 6/6 enchantment creature giant with constellation. So whenever Nylea's Colossus or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, double target creature's power and toughness until the end of turn. So you could just use this as a 7-mana double a creature's power and toughness spell, but where it's really going to shine is when we get something like Niko. If Niko Aris comes in with 7 mana and we make 4 shards, that means we can double a creature's power and toughness 4 times. And that turns something as small as a 1/1 into a 2/2, then a 4/4, then an 8/8, then a 16/16, just by playing Niko and making 4 shards. And that's just a 1/1. Imagine what we could do with an unblockable 4/4 Whitewater Naiads that had an enchantment come in, so now it's unblockable, and we're doubling it 4 times. That can close out the game incredibly quickly, and Nylea's Colossus is easily one of the best finishers we have in the deck, because with something like, say, Amareth, who is a 6-power commander, we only need to double their power about 3 times, and that will close out the game. I guess technically we'd have to double it a couple times just to get us above the 21 damage needed, but if we go from 6 to 12 to 18 all the way up to 24, that's not how math works. You know what I'm saying. Either way, we double it 3 times, then we're good to go. It knocks people out with commander damage. I never claimed to be great at math. Someone else can figure that one out. But Nylea's Colossus is great for that as well. So I do want to highlight that it is very impressive in this deck, and if you can keep it in or you don't mind splurging for it, I do highly recommend it. But if you do need to cut it, it's certainly not necessary. There are other finishers in the deck as well. This is just kind of the most flashy. On the other hand, though, since we're talking about cards to put in and or out of the deck, it's also worth mentioning that there is one card I think should go in this deck that I couldn't squeeze in for budget purposes. So we'll talk about that, and also the card that I would take out if you were to put that card in. So the card that I would recommend putting into the deck is Calyx Guided by Fate. And Calyx Guided by Fate is 1 green and a white for a 2/2 legendary enchantment creature human druid. Constellation. Whenever Calyx or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And whenever Calyx or an enchanted creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may create a token that's a copy of a non-legendary enchantment you control. Do this only once each turn. Now, the reason that I would recommend swapping in Calyx Guided by Fate and swapping out Oath of the Ancient Wood is because if we read Oath of the Ancient Wood, it's 2 and a green, so the same mana cost as Calyx, except there's a white in Calyx that there's not in Oath of the Ancient Wood. It's an enchantment, not an enchantment creature, so we're losing out on a type. And whenever Oath of the Ancient Wood or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It has the exact same text as Calyx, but we're actually losing out on the fact that it's not a creature, and it doesn't copy our enchantments in the same way that Calyx does. So if we're being perfectly honest, for this deck, Calyx is a 100% straight upgrade over Oath of the Ancient Wood, because even though it could be removed by creature removal in a way that Oath of the Ancient Wood can't, having the creature type on Calyx is actually incredibly important because of Amareth in the deck as well. So Calyx being an enchantment creature that can do exactly what Oath of the Ancient Wood does, plus copy our stuff, I think in my mind that makes perfect sense to try to swap him in then. The only downside is, of course, if you look at the price tags, Calyx is a massive $15.33, while Oath of the Ancient Wood is 25 cents. So obviously for budget purposes, Oath of the Ancient Wood is definitely the choice here, but I think if you're looking to make just that slight upgrade, Calyx is what you want to go for. So I think with all of that being said though, we've talked enough about this deck. We gotta talk a little bit about how it's gonna work in a game. So we're gonna jump into a game, we're gonna see how it goes, and we'll see how our deck performs. But as you may know, we do have one thing to do before we get there, and that is to talk about some ways that you could help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So if you are interested, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, send me an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. Those are all great ways to reach out. If you ever have any questions or you like to suggest a card for the channel, those are great ways to do it. You can always put your suggestions into the comments of this YouTube video as well. While you're at it, you might as well also like the video and subscribe to the channel because I would very much appreciate that. But if you're looking for ways to help support us a little bit more directly, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and you can become a channel member right here on YouTube by following the link that's either on screen or in the description of the video below. And if you do decide to join the Patreon or become a channel member, you get to join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Devin Purser, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, and Paddywhack. And what exactly does that get you, you might be asking? Well, you get access to the deck lists that I'm publishing a week early, so you can kind of go through and check it out. And that has become incredibly important because my patrons have definitely caught mistakes that I've made in the past. So thank you to all of the patrons who have actually caught those mistakes. You'll also get access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks, and also that's the first place I look when I'm looking for people to participate in some of the games. So if you've ever wanted to participate in the games and be on this channel, that is a great way to do that. You'll also get the guarantee from me that any card you suggest will be turned into a video eventually, turned into a deck for this channel. I can't promise to get to it right away, but I will get to it eventually. I, of course, do my best to try to get to everyone's suggestions, whether you're a patron, channel member, or not, but I can't promise to do it in the same way I can for my patrons and channel members. And then, of course, last but not least, you also get the unedited gameplay videos every single week, so you can hear the players talking, laughing, having a good time, instead of just my own narration. And I know I said last but not least, but this is actually last but not least. One more thing, you can also get a random card sent to you every single month as a thank you from me. It is random in the sense that it is one of the 4 random cards that we chose for this month's videos, but it's going to be one of those 4 things. It's not going to be completely random. I'm not going to pull a random card out of a comments box and send it to you. It will be one of the 4 cards we built around. So if that is something you are interested in, like I said, check out Patreon, check out the channel membership. But I think I've probably rambled enough, and I know we're all very excited to get into the game. So let's see who our opponents are going to be this week and how we can test out this deck. So Obviously, our opponents, we are joined by 3 of them this week. We are going to be playing up against Luke, playing Masumaru, First to Live, AngryCow, playing Mael the Anima, and Doodle, playing Sir Gwyn, Hero of Ashvale. So, Luke bringing out Masumaru. This is pretty much what it looks like. This is a giant green creature that he wants to make even bigger by just drawing a ton of cards. And I think that this deck is going to be very interesting. I've played a couple of times against it in the past. It is very unique to see a mono green card draw style of deck that really just wants to make a giant creature and then benefit from it. And it's also unique because even though green has a ton of big creatures, Masumaru is typically even bigger than the mono green creatures you would normally expect. So it's a very unique deck, and I'm very excited to be playing against it again. Very interested to see what he can do with it. Next up, we have Cow and his Mael the Anima deck. This is very similar to Masumaru, just kind of a big creature deck, but he does get the added benefit of having red and white in there. And he's very open and honest about the fact that he wants to hit 6 mana with Mael on board and then kind of not cast any more spells for the rest of the game. He just wants to spin Mael every single turn, get a free creature, and just slowly outvalue his opponents. So I've played against plenty of Mael decks in the past. I think I've played against Cows once before as well. And I'm always terrified of what they're going to pull out. So definitely looking forward to that as well. I do like the chaos aspect of it. Big fan of that. And then finally, we have Doodle playing Sir Gwyn, Hero of Ashvale. And you might be looking at this thinking that it is an equipment and a knight style deck, but it's actually a blood token deck. So he has gone out of his way to put in as many ways to make blood tokens as possible because he is specifically built around Arterial Alchemy, which is a card that turns his blood tokens into equipment and gives creatures +2/+0 when the blood is equipped. So he can make a ton of blood and then play Sir Gwyn to just suit her up with a ton of the blood for free, being able to smack people with a giant commander and some blood tokens. Plus, I'm sure he's got some graveyard shenanigans in there because of the blood, discarding cards. But overall, this is a super unique deck. Doodle has talked about it many times, but I don't think I've actually had the chance to play against it. So I am very excited to see what he can do with it. But without any further ado, let me know in the comments which of these commanders you think might be the most difficult for our deck to face. And we'll see how we do. And I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Luke, Cow, and then Doodle. On my first turn, I play a Temple of Enlightenment, scrying 1. Luke plays a Forest. Cow plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Doodle plays a Command Tower. I play a Forest and cast Fertile Ground, enchanting the forest so that it produces an additional mana of any color when it's tapped. Luke plays a Tyrite Sanctum and casts Emerald Medallion, making all his green spells cost 1 less to cast. Cow plays a Forest and casts Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Doodle plays a Path of Ancestry. I play an island and cast Satyr Enchanter, letting me draw a card whenever I cast an enchantment spell. Luke plays a Rogue's Passage, then casts Scepter of Celebration. Cow plays a Forest and casts Drum Hunter, letting him draw a card in his end step if he controls a creature with power 5 or greater. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Exsanguinator Cavalry, so whenever a knight he controls deals combat damage to a player, he puts a +1/+1 counter on it and makes a blood token. I play a Plains and cast Overgrowth, enchanting the Plains so that it produces an additional 2 green mana when it's tapped, and this also draws me a card thanks to the Satyr Enchanter. After that, I cast Arasta of the Endless Web, drawing another card and making a 1/2 spider token with reach whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery. I move to combat and attack Luke for 2 with the Satyr. Luke plays a Forest and passes. Cow plays a Naya Panorama and casts his commander Mael the Anima, letting him pay 6 mana and tap her to look at the top 5 cards of his library, putting a creature with power 5 or greater from among them into play. Doodle moves straight to combat, attacking Luke for 2 with his cavalry, putting a +1/+1 counter on it and making a blood token. Then in his second main phase, he casts Inspiring Statuary, giving all his non-artifact spells Improvise. I play an island and cast a Johnny's Chosen, creating a 2/2 cat token whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under my control. I then cast Ghostly Prison, making my opponents pay 2 mana to attack me, drawing a card and making a 2/2 cat. Then I move to combat and attack Doodle for 5. Luke plays a forest and casts his commander, Masumaro, First to Live, which has power and toughness equal to twice the number of cards in his hand. Then at the end of turn, Cow sacrifices Naya Panorama to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then on Cow's turn, he simply untaps and passes. Doodle plays an Inventor's Fair, then attacks Cow for 3, but before the damage, Cow activates Mael, unfortunately not finding any creatures, so he takes 3 damage while Doodle puts a counter on his cavalry and makes a blood token. In his second main phase, Doodle casts Markov Enforcer, fighting a creature whenever it or another vampire enters under his control, making a blood token when a creature dealt damage by the Enforcer dies. When it enters, it fights a Rasta, killing her and making Doodle a blood token. Then he also casts Path to Exile, exiling my Satyr Enchanter, letting me search my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. On my turn, I play a Plains and cast Elspeth Conquers Death, exiling Markov Enforcer when it enters, creating a cat token. I then cast Whitewater Naiads, making a creature unblockable whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under my control. This time I choose to make a Johnny's Chosen unblockable, and I make another cat token, then I attack Luke for 3. On Luke's turn, he casts Traverse the Outlands, searching his library for 10 basic lands, since he controls a creature with 10 power. He then attacks Doodle for 10 with Masumaro. On Cow's turn, he once again untaps and passes. In Doodle's upkeep, he gains a life with Inventor's Fair since he controls 3 artifacts. He then plays a mountain and casts Strephon Morer Progenitor, letting him make a blood token in his end step for each player who lost life this turn. He then sacrifices a blood token to discard a card and draw a card, then moves to combat and attacks Luke for 4, putting a counter on the cavalry, making yet another blood token. And at the end of turn, Doodle makes another blood token with Strephon since Luke lost life this turn. When I draw for my turn, Elspeth Conquers Death gets a second lore counter, making non-creature spells my opponents cast cost 2 more until my next turn. I then cast my commander Amareth the Lustrous, letting me look at the top card of my library whenever a permanent enters the battlefield, putting it into my hand if it's the same permanent type as the card that entered. I then play a forest, revealing a Myriad Landscape from the top of my library, putting it into my hand, and I cast Starlight Spectacular, putting Courser of Crewfix from the top of my library into my hand, making a cat token and making Whitewater Naiads unblockable. Then, when I move to combat, Starlight Spectacular triggers, letting me choose each of my creatures and give them +1/+1 for each other creature chosen before it. I then attack Doodle for 8 with the Johnny's Chosen, Cow for 10 with the Naiads, and Luke for 15 with the cats. On Luke's turn, he equips Masumaro with Scepter of Celebration, giving him +2/+0, trample, and letting him make citizen tokens equal to the combat damage he deals to a player. He attacks me with Masumaro, and I block with a cat, still taking 12 commander damage while Luke makes 12 citizen tokens. Then, in his second main phase, Luke casts Life's Legacy, sacrificing Masumaro and drawing 12 cards since Masumaro had 12 power. He plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size, and finally casts Psychosis Crawler, which has power and toughness equal to the cards in his hand, and makes each opponent lose a life whenever he draws a card. At the end of turn, Cow activates Mael, putting a giant Ankeg into play, giving all his creatures Trample and Ward 2. Then on Cow's turn, he untaps and passes. But at the end of his turn though, Doodle casts Enlightened Tutor, searching his library for an artifact or enchantment, in this case Arterial Alchemy, putting it on top of his deck. In Doodle's upkeep, he gains a life, then he casts the Arterial Alchemy, making 3 blood tokens since he has 3 opponents, and also turning his blood tokens into equipment that give +2/+0 and equip for 2. This lets him equip Strephon with a blood, making him a 5/2 and attacking Luke for 5, making another blood token in his end step. When I draw for my turn, Elspeth Conquers Death gets its third lore counter, being sacrificed and returning a Rasta from my graveyard to the battlefield, also triggering Amareth, so I put Oath of the Ancients from the top of my library into my hand, make a cat token, and make a Johnny's Chosen unblockable. I then cast the Courser of Krufix, making me play with the top card of my library revealed, but letting me play it if it's a land, and also gaining a life whenever I play a land. This gets me another cat and makes Amareth unblockable, but I don't reveal a card with Amareth. I do, though, play the forest that's on top of my library, gaining a life, but not revealing a card with Amareth. After that, I cast Archetype of Imagination, giving all my creatures flying and preventing my opponent's creatures from having or gaining flying. This also makes me another cat, making a cat unblockable, and lets me reveal Weaver of Harmonies from the top of my deck, putting it into my hand. Before I go to combat, Cow casts Banishing Coils to exile my Starlight Spectacular, sending Guardian Naga on an adventure, making me a spider token and letting me reveal Caliphate, Beloved of the Sea from my library, putting it into my hand. I then attack Luke for 9 and Doodle for 10. This knocks Luke out of the game, but Doodle is able to survive by casting Teferi's Protection, preventing his life total from changing, phasing out all his permanents, and making me a spider. In my second main phase, I cast Caliphate, Beloved of the Sea, which has power equal to my devotion to blue, and makes all my spells my opponents cast that target my creatures or enchantments cost 1 more, plus I make another cat token. On Cow's turn, he plays a Windswept Heath, sacrificing it to search his library for a forest, losing a life and putting it into play, then cast Angel of the Ruins, exiling my Whitewater Naiads and Archetype of Imagination when it enters. In Doodle's upkeep, he gains a life, then he equips a Blood to Exsanguinator Cavalry, giving it +2/+0, and attacks Cow for 12 with both of his creatures. Cow blocks Strephon with his Ankeg, killing the vampire, and then takes 7 while Doodle puts a +1/+1 counter on the cavalry and makes a blood token. Then, in his second main phase, Doodle casts Farewell, exiling all creatures, enchantments, and graveyards, wiping away everyone's boards but keeping all of his artifacts. On my turn, I recast my commander Amareth, then play a forest, not revealing the card with Amareth. After that, I cast Weaver of Harmonies, giving my other enchantment creatures +1/+1, and revealing Colossal Sky Turtle from the top of my library, putting it into my hand. On Cow's turn, he simply recasts his commander Mael and passes. In Doodle's upkeep, he gains a life, then casts his commander, Sir Gwyn, Hero of Ashvale, letting him draw a card and lose a life whenever an equipped creature he controls attacks, and also lets him equip knights for 0 mana. I play a Temple of Mystery, scrying 1, not revealing a card with Amareth. Then I cast Oath of the Ancients, putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature whenever it or another enchantment enters under my control, this time putting a counter on Amareth, but still not revealing the top card of my library. Finally, I cast Colossal Sky Turtle, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, revealing Tuvasa the Sunlit from the top of my library, putting it into my hand. I move to combat and attack Doodle for 7 with Amareth, but before damage, he casts Dispatch, exiling her and taking no damage. Cow plays a forest and casts Ancient Gold Dragon, which lets him roll a d20 when it deals combat damage to a player, then he makes a number of 1/1 fairy dragons equal to the number rolled. In Doodle's upkeep, he gains a life, then plays a Godless Shrine untapped, paying 2 life, and activates Inventor's Fair, sacrificing it to search his library for an artifact, in this case Ceremonial Knife, putting it into his hand. Then he casts and equips it to Sir Gwyn, giving her +1/+0 and making a blood token whenever she deals combat damage. He attacks Cow for 6 with Sir Gwyn, drawing a card and losing a life, then Cow blocks with Mael and his dragon, killing both commanders while Doodle makes another blood token. On my turn, I cast Tuvasa the Sunlit, letting me draw a card whenever I cast my first enchantment spell each turn, and giving her +1/+1 for each enchantment I control. I then cast Imprisoned in the Moon, enchanting Cow's Ancient Gold Dragon, turning it into a land that taps for colorless mana, putting a 1/1 counter on my turtle, and drawing a card. After After that, I cast Invasion of Theros, choosing Doodle to defend it, searching my library for an enchantment, in this case Ethereal Armor, putting it into my hand, then casting it, enchanting Weaver of Harmonies, giving it +X, where X is the number of enchantments I control, which is currently 5, and I put a +1/+1 counter on the turtle. I move to combat, attacking Doodle for 10 and the Invasion for 7, transforming it into Ifara Ever Sheltering, putting a counter on herself, letting me draw a card whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under my control. Cow plays Jetmir's Garden, then cast Wave of Vitriol, making everyone sacrifice all their artifacts, enchantments, and non-basic lands, searching their libraries for a basic land to replace each non-basic land destroyed this way. Unfortunately, this wipes away most of mine and Doodle's boards, but ends up bringing back Cow's Ancient Gold Dragon. This allows him to attack me for 7, rolling a 14 on a d20, making 14 Fairy Dragon tokens. On Doodle's turn, he casts Odric the Bloodcursed. On my turn, I cast Krufix, God of Horizons, drawing a card with Tuvasa, and also cast Ancestral Mask, enchanting Tuvasa, giving her +2/+2 for each other enchantment in play. Then I play a Myriad Landscape and pass. Cow attacks me for 10 with his fairies, leaving some back just in case, and also attacks Doodle for 7 with his dragon, rolling another 14 to make 14 more fairy dragons. In his second main phase, he casts Shamanic Revelation, drawing 29 cards since he controls 29 creatures, and gains 4 life since he controls a creature with power 4 or greater. Then he plays a Plains and passes. Doodle casts Sword of Hearth and Home, equipping it to Odric, giving him +2/+2 and protection from green and white. I play a Plains, then recast my commander Amareth, and cast Verduran Enchantress, not revealing a card from my library. On Cow's turn, he casts Fight Rigging, hiding away a card and casting it for free when he moves to combat since he controls a creature with 7 power. This lets him cast Titanic Ultimatum, giving all his creatures +5/+5, lifelink, first strike, and trample, hitting Doodle and I for 70 and 79 damage respectively, knocking us both out and winning Cow the game. Alright, so that was a super sweet game. I definitely did not expect the ending of it. I didn't think Cow was going to be able to pull it out at the end, especially because he was on 6 mana for almost the entire game. But it turns out spinning into some big creatures, or I guess in this case casting some big creatures, he really didn't spin into much with Mael, was enough to close out the game. I do think, though, that in the end I made the right decision in taking Luke out of the game when I did, and he was also very honest that if he had been able to untap with that Psychosis Crawler, he was going to win the game. So definitely the right decision was made, but it was still very cool to see the mono green card draw deck go off. Being able to draw just 12 cards kind of out of nowhere, make 12 citizens, drop a Psychosis Crawler. Very, very cool stuff, and I look forward to seeing that deck again in the future. As I mentioned, Mael from Cow also did very well. Even though it looked like she wasn't doing too much in the beginning, Mael really stepped it up toward the end by just dropping creature after creature after creature, and Cow really benefited from the Ancient Gold Dragon, especially because he was able to roll 2 14s in a row to make a ton of fairy dragons. I think that if he had made just a couple on the first turn, there's a good chance that Doodle and I could have done enough damage to maybe take him out, but that wasn't quite to be in this game, so a very impressive victory for Cow. Next up, Doodle's Blood Token deck was very impressive, and I think really the MVP of his deck was Inspiring Statuary, being able to give all of his spells improvise, well, his non-artifact spells improvise, I should say, made quite the difference because he was also stuck on very few lands for most of the game, but being able to tap his blood essentially for mana meant that he could kind of keep up with the rest of the table, and being able to cast that Farewell when he did to keep his artifacts but get rid of everything else put him in quite the state. And if he had found some way to keep his Arterial Alchemy at that point, I don't think the rest of us could have kept up. I think he would have just started knocking people out of the game. So very cool showing from Sir Gwyn, and I hope we get to see that deck again in the future. And then finally, of course, we got to talk about our Niko Aris deck, the Aris Tour, if you will. And I think it performed very well. I actually had the chance to play this deck several times, a couple times off camera, and I did record another game, but the footage got a little bit messed up, so we didn't get to see that one. But overall, every time I played this deck, it was very, very impressive. The ability to ramp quickly with some enchantments really made all the difference, and being able to get Amareth on board very quickly to turn into a card draw engine or just use Enchantress effects. I still have yet to draw Niko with this deck, which is unfortunate because I do think Niko's ability to make shards is very relevant for what we're trying to do, so maybe another time. But I do think the deck performed well, and it was also very resilient. Considering we got a lot of our enchantments exiled over the course of the game, we were still able to kind of keep drawing cards and keep putting big creatures into play. Even at the end, we had to Vasa, and I think that if Cow hadn't had a board of giant flying creatures, we probably could have stabilized and started to kind of get our way out of it, but not in this case, unfortunately. So overall, let me know what you think down in the comments. Let me know if there's any cards you think were the MVP of the game, or maybe that should be put into or taken out of the deck. I always love to hear what people think of it. So let me know what you think. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.
It's 9 with the Weaver. Hello!
It is a 9/8.
Who is that
Or
cookie?
Oh, I do not have enough mana for both. Oh my god.
She's not a cookie. Her name is Snickers.
Even better!
Still a snack, though.
Is this gonna make it into the bloopers?
I mean, yeah, probably.